So if you want to brew a beer, you need a recipe. With all the sources out there for recipes, how can you find a good recipe? Well, stick around, I'll show you some of my favorite sources for a recipe, and then we'll track down a recipe for a Belgian Blonde. Let's get brewing! My name is Brent from Cascades Homebrew. Thanks for stopping by on this Friday evening. I'm down here in the brewery and with some books and my computer, and we're going to talk a little bit about recipe development. So I was wanting to brew a Belgian Blonde. I'd never brewed a Belgian Blonde before, so I needed to track down a recipe for the Belgian Blonde, and that got me thinking maybe it'd be a good topic to talk with you guys about how I track down recipes and what my process has been. So let's go ahead while I share some of my favorite sources of recipes, and then we'll cycle back and see how I applied those to creating a Belgian Blonde recipe. First off, let me say that this video is more about finding recipes than necessarily authoring your own recipe. There seems to be this infatuation that I see on brewers. Oh, I need to create my own recipe. Like using some kind of published recipe, maybe it's cheating or something. So have you ever been at dinner and said to your dad, "Are you cheating? This is grandma's lasagna recipe." Have you ever made fun of your mom for making a Thanksgiving meal based on recipes from a book? So the first medal I ever won in a competition was from a recipe that came directly out of the book Brewing Classic Styles. I was not ashamed. Yes, I agree that creating recipes and tweaking recipes and giving recipes your own spin is an enjoyable part of the hobby, but I also say there's no shame in using either a published recipe or even just going out and buying a packaged kit. So have a target in mind. You're much more likely to hit that target if you start out with a proven recipe, or at least take ideas and inspiration from other proven recipes. So often my first stop is the BJCP Style Guidelines. The Style Guidelines are a great source of information, especially when you're trying to target a specific style, and really important when you're trying to target recipes for a competition. So if we jump over to the BJCP site, it's a little bit awkward to get to the styles. You can get there either through scrolling and paging, and that's pretty tedious. They have a kind of an awkward menu where you have to click down, click down. I find it's maybe a little easier to do the search. It's a little awkward, but if you search and then you click over on the Styles tab, it'll get you to where you're going. There's also apps for both Android and iOS. Those are great when you're out and about or at a meeting. So for each style in the guideline, they start with an overall impression. This gives you a quick overview of the style to get your bearings. And then they go into appearance, aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel. Now these all map directly to what you would see in a competition score sheet. The comments, history, and characteristic ingredient sections provide more detail and information on the style. The style comparison section is often very useful because there's overlap between some styles, or you may be familiar with one of the related styles, and this kind of tells you what may be similar and what may be different. The vital statistics will give you the general targets for stats like IBUs and gravities and ABVs. So a good example should be somewhere in those guidelines, but they're not hard and fast, but you should keep them in mind, especially for competition entries. The commercial example section is also very useful. They list a number of example commercial styles. Trying one of those is a great way to get an understanding of a style that you're not familiar with. And also after you've brewed a beer, it's a great way to come back and see how well you've done. So now let's get into some of my favorite sources for recipes. I'm going to list these in no specific order, and I'll put links to any online resources down below in the comments. The first one I want to talk about is the American Homebrewers Association list of recipes. This is a great list of both quality cologne recipes as well as award-winning homebrew recipes. Many of the recipes do require membership, but there are plenty of free ones as well. It's also a good reason to sign up for a membership. I find this to be a better source of all grain recipes than extract, but there are some extract recipes in there as well. Another source that I find valuable is the Make Your Best articles over at Craft Beer and Brewing. I'm not sure if they're all written by Josh Weichert, but I think most of them are. For most styles, there's an article that drives into the style and gives recommendations for grain, hops, yeast, etc. Really a lot of detail on how to brew the beer. There's also usually a couple recipes that kind of back up the article. Another great source for recipe are books. One of the best, I would say, is this one here, Brewing Classic Styles. It's by Jamel Zainasheff and John Palmer. So it's an excellent book that contains award-winning recipes for most styles. There's generally a quick overview of the style and some background on the recipe. Recipes are presented as extract with all grain options, though I think they're all likely originally brewed as all grain recipes and then converted to extract. I find some of the recipes might be a little bit dated, and they do kind of showcase Jamil's preferences, but they were all award-winning recipes, so they're a great place to start. Another recipe book I have is this Modern Homebrew Recipes by Gordon Strong. So I add this here with a caveat that I've not actually brewed any specific recipes from this book, but I have got ideas looking through the various recipes. It's similar in the Brewing Classic Styles in that he provides an overview of the style, several recipes. One thing I like about the recipes in the book is Gordon often provides some options for different grains or maybe different hops, different ways to mix up the recipe. So it's fairly up to date. It was published in 2015, and Gordon Strong is an award-winning homebrewer. Another great place for recipes are homebrewing books. For example, How to Brew by John Palmer has an excellent section of recipes, and these are especially great if you're a beginning brewer. He lays out both all grain and extract versions of all the recipes. I don't have a copy of the book, but I'm sure Mastering Homebrew by Randy Mosher is also a great source of recipes. So it's hard to talk about recipes in books without making a mention to Designing Great Beer by Ray Daniels. So the caveats I have about this book is it's a bit dated. It was published in 1996. It's also a bit focused on creating recipes from scratch, which isn't exactly the focus of this video. And in the vein of designing great beers, I want to throw out an honorable mention to Mean Brews on YouTube. He's got a channel where he analyzes award-winning recipes. Every week he puts out a new one. It contains analysis of the recipes and the ingredients that go into those, and at the end he provides an example recipe. They look pretty good. I haven't brewed any of them. Another great source of recipes are online vendors like More Beer and Northern Brewer. They both make some very quality kits with high quality ingredients. For most of them, you can download a sheet that includes all the ingredients listed along with step-by-step instructions. Or you can just order the kit and brew it as designed. So another potential source for information is a search engine like Google. This is where you need to start being a little bit careful. So if there's a beer that has traits that I want, or I just want to clone that beer, I will search for X clone recipe. Usually I'll get some hits. First I look at the articles or recipes from the reputable source, or maybe I'll find a good discussion thread on a forum about the recipe. Sometimes a brewer will actually put out the exact recipe, or at least a list of the ingredients. So as I'll cover in a second, if you find recipes in a recipe database, take them with a big grain of salt. Just because the recipe is titled Heady Topper Clone doesn't mean it's a good clone. The next one I'll mention is one that people seem to like. I don't necessarily use it myself, but that's the Homebrew Talk forum recipes. So I'm a regular on the Homebrew Talk forum, and I find them to be valuable resources. The recipe section though, I don't know, I'm just not a big fan. I find most of the top recipes to be a bit outdated. Some of them are just not that great, or maybe they're just not styles that I enjoy brewing. Sometimes the discussion is valuable, but it just takes time and experience to sort through and find good recipes there, is my experience. And then my big caution I want to throw out are just the generic recipe databases out there. I'm not a fan. They're useful for finding some information, but they contain a mix of both really excellent recipes. There's just new and untested recipes. You don't know if the person has ever even brewed the recipe or if they were just coming up with ideas. There's some recipes in there that are just outdated, and there's just flat out bad recipes. So if you have an experience with recipes, you can maybe be able to go through there and pick out red flags and find good recipes. But if you're new to creating and finding recipes, I would stay away from those. This is one area of homebrewing that I would like to see improved. If you're looking for, say, a peach cobbler recipe, there's a lot of good recipe databases out there where you can find good recipes and feedback. I just don't find the same with homebrewing recipes. So before we move on to tracking down a Belgian Blonde recipe, if you like this kind of educational content, be sure to hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel if you want to get notifications of future content. Do you have some favorite recipe sources that I left out? If so, let me know down in the comments. So I started my search for a Belgian Blonde recipe by looking at the style guidelines. So if we look at the style guidelines for a Belgian Blonde, the overall impression, a moderate strength golden ale that has subtle fruity, spicy Belgian yeast complexity, slightly malty, sweet flavor, and dry finish. So that sounds good. We look at the appearance, the aroma, flavor, mouthfeel, all great information. Comments, history, characteristic ingredients. So for this particular style, the style comparison is useful. Similar strength as a double, similar character as a Belgian strong golden ale or triple. So that gives me a frame of mind. I recently brewed a triple. It says although it's a bit sweeter, but not as bitter. When we look into the vital statistics, we see there's a lot of overlap. So I'm aiming for on the lower end of the original gravity. I feel like once you push it up too high, it's really starting to overlap with the golden ale and triple. As far as the commercial examples, I did track down a Belgian Blond 6-pack to try. I don't know if it's the best example of the style, but it was actually a pretty good beer. It's better than I remembered it. And then we turn over to our good pal Google and see what they can turn up. Turn up many good recipes. One of the first ones was a craft beer and brewing recipe to make your best Belgian Blonde ale. Just like I'd mentioned before, these are really great recipes that cover the style, the ingredients, process, and then also some recipes. Another one I found was a Brew Your Own magazine article by Jamil Zainashev, Belgian Blonde style profile. It's a little bit of overlap with what's in Brewing Classic Styles, and the recipe that's given is very similar, but it expands on additional information on the style, and I got a lot of information from this particular article. Also turned up an excellent article on kegerator.com. This is not a site that's normally on my radar, but I'm thinking maybe it should be. This was one of the most comprehensive articles that I found. I got a lot of great information on how to brew a Belgian Blonde. So turning to the American Homebrewers Association site, there wasn't quite as many resources or recipes for Belgian Blonde as there are from some other styles. The one Belgian Blonde recipe they had up there did look pretty good, and it kind of mirrored a lot of the things that were talked about in the other articles and the other recipes that I was finding. The top link that was out there for a recipe database for Brugger kind of showcases a little bit of my reservations for using these type of sites. I think there are better ones than this particular site, but you can see this one, it just has very little information. While the recipe itself seems like okay, there's really little information on mashing and fermentation, so I would stay away from this particular recipe. So after looking at the style guidelines, reading several articles that talked about Belgian Blonde ales, and then also looking at different recipes, I came up with some common traits across all those recipes. If we look at the grain bill, a Belgian Pilsner was very common. Sometimes they used a Belgian Pale Ale, and sometimes a German Pilsner malt was used. Most recipes had a small amount of a character malt, say like a Victory malt or an aromatic malt or maybe a Munich malt. Most recipes had a medium percentage of sugar. Often this was just simple cane sugar. Sometimes they used special Belgian sugar. The vast majority of the recipe were using European noble hops, stuff like Hallertau Mittelfuhr, or Saaz, or Styrian Golding. I saw there was a mix of different yeasts that were used. I didn't see a lot about water profiles in the articles that I saw, but there is some good information in the water book on different style profiles. As far as mashing, I was often seeing low mash temps to try to drive attenuation. Sometimes step mashes were common. So when I start driving into a recipe, the other thing that I take into account is my different experience. And while I say I have never brewed a Belgian Blonde before, I've brewed several Belgian beers. I recently brewed a Belgian Triple. About a year ago, I brewed a Belgian Single, so a Blonde kind of fits a little bit in between those two. I brewed a couple doubles, a couple quads, I brewed some saisons, so I have some familiarity with grain bills that stretch across those styles. So a lot of the ingredients that were listed for Belgian Blondes are stuff that I've used. Belgian Pilsner, German Pilsner, noble hop, brewed with sugar. And over about the last 2 years, I've really been focused on brewing some Belgian beers. So I do have some good experience with a mix of Belgian yeast and understanding some different fermentation control and different schedules and how to drive character out of those yeasts. So after all that, what did I come up with? Well, I ended up settling on the recipe from Jamil Zainashev that was in the BYO article. It's really almost the same recipe that's in his Brewing Classic Styles book. Although in my mind, I used the recipe almost exactly, I really did do a couple tweaks. I made a couple tweaks to the grain bill, mostly just to get the numbers right in my software. And then also just because as an American, there's something weird about adding 7 ounces versus 8 ounces, half a pound of something. I ended up using both different hops and different yeasts. The hops that I use are Hersbrucker. It's a hop that I've used quite often. I do like it. I bought a pound of it not too long ago, so I've been using that in a lot of my Belgian beers. And as far as the yeast, I've really been digging into dry yeast lately, so I use 2 different dry yeasts. I'll cover that more in the video about the brewing and tasting those beers. Another change from the stated recipe was just adopting it to my brew in the bag process. So the Belgian Blonde I brewed is fermenting now It's actually ready to be kegged. So if we look back a little bit on what we talked about, 1, using a published recipe or even just purchasing a kit is a great place to start if you're looking for a recipe. 2, look at the style guidelines and then look at reputable sources to track down a good recipe that fits you. 3, keep in mind that you may need to make some changes to the recipe just to adapt it to specific ingredients that you have or that are available, or to adapt it to your specific brewing process. And 4, brew the beer, evaluate it, learn, and then evolve moving forward. So in future videos, I hope to talk more about the specifics of creating recipes from scratch, about using software to calculate statistics of recipes, and also about adapting recipes to fit your process and equipment. But for now, check out this playlist on other how-to videos, and also check out this video that YouTube thinks you should watch for building great beer, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.